Hey there, my name is Alex, I am the Mont, and this is a review of Code Vein, played on PC using Steam. Disclaimer time. I received a review code for this game from Bandai Namco in a press kit. If you'd like to see what else was in the press kit, well, I made a video on that not long ago. But, on with the review. What is Code Vein? Have you played Dark Souls? Then Code Vein is anime Dark Souls. If you haven't played Dark Souls, then let me go into a little more detail. Code Vein is an action RPG in a post-apocalyptic setting. My first playthrough took me around 30 to 35 hours. There is a New Game Plus mode, though it does not change anything beyond the strength of enemies really, and there's online co-op. As for the story, following an attack on humanity that wiped out nearly half of mankind, researchers created immortal soldiers who could only be killed by having their heart destroyed. Unfortunately, the queen of these revenants, or vampires, went mad, and the weapon they had made to defend themselves ended up being another dire threat. Whilst the queen was eventually killed, the vampires or revenants were left in a stagnant world, trapped in a mysterious red mist, cut off from the rest of humanity, with a constant thirst for blood that was obviously dwindling in supply. The game follows your character's adventure to find new sources of blood whilst uncovering the truth behind these events. The story is serviceable in Code Vein, but nothing about it is particularly great. Most of it is delivered via cutscenes or interactive flashbacks, wherein you walk through a memory, listening to conversations or monologues. Environmental storytelling is bare bones, but there are Dark Souls style item descriptions to give you a bit more flavour here and there. For the most part, the story is very straightforward. Even if there are some convoluted terminology here and there, not everyone's motivation makes that much sense. Also, the game comes with an English and a Japanese dub. I played with the Japanese one because the English one is, well, it sounds like they are reading off a script with zero direction. Quite often a character's tone does not match at all the situation they are in. When a character should be sounding sad, they sound confused or angry, and it's tone deaf. At least with the Japanese one, characters had the appropriate emotions and tone. Either way, nothing about the voiceover nor the script really stood out. You're probably more interested in gameplay though, considering this is a video game. Well, Code Vein starts you off with creating your character. Whilst there's no sliders for your character's height, and your physique can only range from underweight to skinny, there's a very small selection of outfits as well in the character creator, but they make up for that with a huge amount of customization that can be done via colours. Most every part of your outfit can have an individual colour or material applied to it. It could be metallic gold or a fabric pattern, so on and so forth. You can also equip accessories to your characters, hats, gloves, you name it, which can allow people to make some very creative or terrifying abominations. Either way, it's easy to lose an hour in the character creator just messing around, although nothing about character creation will really have any effect on gameplay. It's all strictly cosmetic. I was going to make a Fulu themed character, then I realised people would go, "Is that Sephiroth?" So I didn't. But I kept that long hair because man, it's pretty fab. Then when you get into the game, you'll be walking around through semi-open areas that usually connect one to the other, mapping it out, looking for treasure, fighting enemies, and using a familiar checkpoint system. Every time you rest at a checkpoint, your healing will restock, enemies will respawn, apart from bosses, and you can teleport to any other checkpoint. There's also a hub where you can chat with NPCs, give them items to exchange for gifts, alter your appearance, upgrade your gear, and the like. Oh, and you can have a bath in hot springs because anime. So you're a Souls fan and you want to know, how's the combat in Code Vein? Well, classes and stats are determined by equipment. Instead of choosing a warrior or a mage class and then being stuck with it, you have blood codes. These are effectively your classes. They are items that you can equip and change at any time. They grant you a set of stats. For example, the fighter code will give you a high strength stat, whereas the caster one will give you a high willpower, that's the magic stat. Then we have gifts. These are effectively abilities and spells. Some are obtained via codes, others are just found out in the world. So the fighter code would probably have some sort of sword gift, whereas the caster one would obviously have spells. and these range from things like weapon abilities, such as a sweeping cyclone attack with your greatsword, to magic spells like fireballs or coating you and your partner's weapon in lightning, to defensive buffs. And even if a gift is tied to a specific code, you can max it out, then unlock the ability to equip it with any other code. Although there are a few codes that are locked to one gift. These are usually very specific ones though. As for weapons, well, you've got this standard affair. Swords, greatswords, polearms, hammers, axes, and bayonets. Then we have armour, also known as blood veils. These determine your drain attacks, in essence your parry, your backstab, and a charged up attack. These all change depending on which blood veil you have equipped. Some may have longer wind up but more active frames, others might have more range to them but come out slower. You get the idea. The combat in general feels alright. If I had to compare it with a Souls game, I would say the overall feel of it is closest to Dark Souls 2, but thankfully there's no adaptability or anything like that. Hit detection felt fine to me whilst I played. You're able to use animations that physically send you up to, say, jump over an enemy attack. And if you're used to abusing iframes to dodge through enemy attacks as well, well, you can do that here of course. Circling around enemies to backstab them is of course very effective. One thing I will point out, the game's stagger system is more like Neo's than Dark Souls. What that means is, if an enemy has hit you once already and they're about to hit you again in a combo, your best bet is to block instead of roll. Now personally, I prefer that, as I think it makes a lot more sense. If someone was slapping you in the face over and over, it would be a lot easier to just raise your arms than to attempt combat rolling away whilst being slapped. In essence though, the recovery frames for guarding are more forgiving than for rolling. Then there's the companion system. You can play 95 to 99% of Code Vein with an AI companion. Now this companion will follow you around, attack enemies, comment on things they see, and so forth. This is optional too. You can tell them to go. But on that note, let's move into the positives and negatives, shall we? Starting with positives. The AI companion system, first and foremost, impressed me the most in the game. They are competent, and they hardly ever give you a headache, so if you're wondering it's going to be like Sheva in RE5, it's okay. You don't need to babysit them, they're not going to fall off ledges, they're not going to be destroyed by every enemy. AI companions are able to dodge, block, deal good amounts of damage, and generally they feel effective. They can even help revive you if you die. They are more than capable of holding their own and taking down enemies. And in fact, this leads nicely into the next point. Difficulty. Code Vein has a very nice, organic difficulty setting, you might say. If you want to play the game in hard mode, then you can leave your AI companion at home and go it alone. The benefit to doing this is that you would get more kills. Whilst you will obtain souls or haze any time an enemy dies from any means, you'll only increase your proficiency with skills if you land the killing blow, it seems. For example, if you want to master a skill so you can use it with any blood code, then you need to kill a certain amount of enemies whilst you have it equipped. You can also play the game on normal mode by bringing an AI companion along with you. Then if you want to play on easier mode, you can summon another player. I prefer this format of difficulty as opposed to loading a game up and it offering me a list of arbitrarily defined difficulty options. This is more like you can choose it at any time, you can adjust on the fly, and I think it's a good idea. Dark Souls did something similar. And of course, you can also make it harder by not leveling up or not upgrading your weapons. Then we have the game's balance. I feel like we've got a good system here. I played through most of the game using a greatsword, which was very strong. The casters are also really powerful. As for the enemies, none of them provide a stupid high difficulty spike, but nor do they feel like extreme pushovers, with the exception of 2 mini-bosses who were exceedingly weak and just got stun-locked comically. Near the end of the game, there are 2 bosses, technically 3, all very close to the other. You probably know who I'm talking about if you've played the game, and I found them a bit frustrating, but it was more, these guys are annoying more than actually hard. So overall the game feels well optimized and balanced in that sense. The difficulty is pretty good, but there's not much of a curve, I would say. Usually in a game, you would expect the difficulty to gradually ramp up, but in Code Vein, it's more like it spikes and then it goes back down and then it spikes again here and there. The game's length and amount of content likewise was satisfactory to me. There are multiple endings, but nothing in the game really changes other than the ending cutscene and obtaining a few more blood codes. I did the main content as well as all the side stuff. There's 12 optional dungeons, for example, which are called the Depths. They vaguely remind me of Chalice dungeons, ever so slightly. As for the endings, I got the... people are calling it the true ending or the good ending. I think it was called... I've actually forgotten what it was called in the achievement list, but hey, I got the longest ending, shall we say. The game's mapping system is my next point. I'm a big fan of it. In essence, whilst you have a mini-map in Code Vein, it is obscured until you actually fill it out. There are items in the world, when you activate them, they will clear away that fog of war to reveal the map properly. There's also a breadcrumb GPS system or something. It shows you the path you've walked so far. It's incredibly useful for exploring, as you can see which paths you've taken and which you haven't. I think it's a good compromise between the versatility and usefulness of a minimap versus the need to explore for yourself. But now let's move on to the negatives, and I've got to start with another aspect of the level, their visual design. Whilst the maps and levels are designed in a nice way with shortcuts, multiple paths, verticality and all that, most of the areas in the game just felt extremely generic and uninspired to me. This problem compounds itself in the latter half of the game where you literally go from ice stage to fire stage to desert stage, one after the other. Much like Neo, this game has enjoyable combat, but the environments are rather bland and samey. Although the combat isn't as good as Neo's, and the environments aren't as generic as Neo's. Oh, and the fire level has fire floor surfaces you need to walk on that hurt you. That's really obnoxious, and I don't like it. Then there's the online. And yeah, I know, I love co-op in games, it's like my favourite thing. And yet, Code Vein's co-op doesn't feel very good. For starters, there's a bit of lag. That happens in every game, though, so whatever. But more importantly, the game doesn't feel right in co-op. Here is every co-op experience I had in Code Vein. One player rampages ahead and obliterates everything, whilst the other player sprints along behind them hoovering up items. The only time co-op feels like actual cooperation is against bosses who don't die in one hit and can't be stun-locked. The non-boss combat and exploration in co-op, it just feels stilted to me. Although the gestures and voice lines are a nice touch. And of course, Dark Souls and other similar games have had similar issues with the co-op, but it never felt as pronounced to me as it does in Code Vein. I never felt so much like I'm just following this person I've summoned, or when I've been summoned, I either fight stuff or I just stand there letting the host fight everything. There isn't a good balance there. Then we have the game's technical performance. Whilst I feel like my frame rate was generally fine whilst playing Code Vein, it didn't feel very smooth. Can't quite put my finger on it. But there were these sorts of micro stutters and general feeling of judderiness to the game. A larger issue were the loading screens. Now, I didn't install this game on my SSD, but the loading times still felt long, especially considering the game encourages you to teleport from area to area, every single area, after a story point to check for new side quests. Long loading times in that situation? No thanks. I will point out, they aren't absurdly long or anything, they just felt long enough for me to notice it. And if a game's gonna have long loading screens, then it shouldn't have many loading screens, if that makes sense. Finally, the game's overall presentation and music. I have no real strong feelings on it. The game is an incredibly anime-looking game, and just about every anime trope you can expect will show up in some way or another. The music seemed fine, like decent, but only the main theme really stood out to me. And I find it hard to take all of this constant melodrama seriously when the characters look the way they do, especially considering most of the females are flopping about all over the place. You know, which is fine, I just can't take it seriously. It's like if you're playing an MMO, you have a really serious cutscene happening with the final boss, then some dude in the background is wearing Speedos, or has like a giant unicorn horse head, or something weird like that. Or something dramatic happening in Monster Hunter, whilst you have the Wiggler head. Only in this case, it's how the game itself is portraying its characters. It's very over the top and ridiculous. Dark Souls wouldn't really have that sullen atmosphere if the Firekeeper was morosely monologuing, all whilst wearing a tiny sling bikini. There's a weird disconnect, and I find it jarring, because Code Vein is clearly going for constant melodrama and sad, bad things happening to everyone. I don't care if the characters are sexy or wearing revealing clothing, it's just don't try and cram that into a story you're trying to put across as like super serious. That's my issue with it. Causes a disconnect. Anyway, Code Vein. It's a game I enjoyed playing through, and it's definitely one of the best Souls clones out there that I've played. But it's never going to escape the shadow of Dark Souls, because so much of the game seems to be going, here's something that will remind you of Dark Souls. Sometimes those things are vague, other times it's an area that looks like it's flat out copy-pasted from Dark Souls. There isn't a huge amount of depth to the gameplay, but it's fun to fight enemies and it's fun to try out the different abilities. So if you're itching for something like Dark Souls on the gameplay front, Code Vein should work for you. And of course, if you have any questions I didn't cover in the video, leave them down below. Or indeed if you have any other feedback. Until next time, you guys take care. And I'll catch you real soon. Ciao.